May 27, 1940. L'Épinette, France. The German patrol was confident. They were moving through the French countryside, pushing the British army back toward the sea. They had machine guns, they had mortars, they had the best modern equipment in the world. They were walking down a country lane, chatting quietly. They felt safe. They knew the British were retreating. They knew the enemy was demoralized. Hidden behind a stone wall, a British officer was watching them. But this officer didn't look like the others. He wasn't holding a Webley service revolver. He wasn't holding a submachine gun. He wasn't even holding a rifle. He was holding a yew wood longbow, a weapon from the Middle Ages. He had a quiver of arrows slung over his shoulder, and on his belt, where his ammunition pouch should have been, hung a massive basket-hilted Scottish broadsword, a claymore. The men next to him, soldiers of the Manchester Regiment, were nervous. They gripped their rifles with sweaty hands. They looked at their commander, wondering if he had lost his mind. They were about to ambush a German unit with automatic weapons, and their leader was planning to start the fight with a stick and a string. The German sergeant walked closer. He was 80 yards away, 50 yards, 30 yards. The British soldiers waited for the whistle. That was the standard signal to open fire. But the whistle never came. Instead, the officer stood up. He drew the string of the bow back to his ear. The wood creaked under the tension. He took a breath. He aimed at the German sergeant's chest. For a split second, the German sergeant saw him. He must have been confused. He must have thought he was looking at a ghost or a hallucination. Who brings a bow to a gunfight? He probably wanted to laugh. Thwack! The arrow flew silently through the air. It crossed the 30 yards in a heartbeat. It struck the German sergeant directly in the chest. He didn't scream. He just dropped. Before the German body hit the ground, the officer shouted, "Fire!" The British machine guns opened up. The ambush was chaotic and brutal, but amidst the noise of the gunfire, the German soldiers were terrified. They had seen their leader taken out by a silent missile from nowhere. This was the introduction of Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill to the Wehrmacht. They called him Mad Jack, and for the next 5 years, he would prove that a medieval warrior could not only survive in a modern war, he could dominate it. But before we see how he captured 42 men with just a sword, I need to ask you a favor. Stories like Jack Churchill's are rare. They sound like fiction, but they are 100% real. If you want to help us keep these stories alive, please hit that subscribe button right now. It tells the algorithm that history matters. And I want to know who is watching today. Drop a comment down below. Tell me what country or state you're in. I read every single one. Now, let's meet the man who brought a sword to World War II.
To understand Jack Churchill, you have to understand that he wasn't built for the 20th century. He was born in 1906 into a family of old-school British civil servants. He graduated from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, the most prestigious military school in Britain. But Jack had a problem. He was bored. He graduated in 1926, right in the middle of peace. There were no wars to fight. There were no dragons to slay. He was stationed in Burma, and while other officers spent their time drinking gin and playing cards, Jack bought a motorcycle. He drove it almost the entire length of India. He crashed into a water buffalo. He survived. He picked up the bagpipes, not because he was Scottish, he wasn't, but because he liked the sound. He became so good that he was the only Englishman to place second in the military piping championships. Then he picked up archery. He didn't just dabble in it, he became a world-class shot. He represented Great Britain in the World Archery Championships in Oslo in 1939. But the army in peacetime was too slow for him. He resigned his commission, he worked as a newspaper editor, he worked as a male model. He even appeared as an extra in the movie Ivanhoe because he was one of the few people in England who could actually shoot a longbow and row a boat properly. He was restless. He felt like a tiger in a cage. Then came September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Most people were terrified. Jack Churchill was delighted. He famously said, "I was back in my red coat, the country having got into a jam in my absence." He ran back to the recruitment office. He got his commission back. And as he packed his kit bag, he made a decision. The Army regulations said an officer had to carry a revolver. They said he had to carry a map case. Jack looked at his collection on the wall. He took down his longbow. He packed his arrows. He took down his Scottish broadsword, a heavy, double-edged blade meant for hacking through armor. He told his friends, "In my opinion, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." He wasn't joking. When he arrived in France with the British Expeditionary Force, he was a strange sight. He rode a motorcycle with his longbow strapped to the side and arrows sticking out of his pannier bags. The other officers laughed at him. They thought he was an eccentric. They thought he was trying to be funny. They stopped laughing during the retreat to Dunkirk. The British Army was collapsing. The Germans were pushing them into the sea. It was chaos. Units were breaking, routing. Men were throwing away their rifles to run faster. But amidst the panic, there was Jack. He was riding his motorcycle up and down the lines. He was calm. He was smiling. He had his bow on his back and his sword at his hip. When the men saw him, they stopped running. If this crazy officer wasn't scared, why should they be? He rallied them. He led counterattacks. He used his longbow to silently take out sentries. He survived Dunkirk. He got back to England, and while most of the army was licking its wounds, Jack was looking for the next fight. He volunteered for a new top-secret unit. They were called the Commandos.
The Commandos were built for men like Jack. They were designed for hit-and-run raids. They were trained to fight dirty. They were the pirates of the British Army. Jack loved it. He became the second in command of No. 3 Commando. In December 1941, the Commandos launched Operation Archery. The target was a German garrison on the island of WWII in Norway. The plan was a classic amphibious assault. The landing craft would hit the beach, the ramp would drop, the men would charge out firing their Thompson submachine guns. Jack had a different plan. As the landing craft roared toward the snowy beach, the German defenders were waiting. Their machine guns were trained on the water. They expected the British to come out shouting. Instead, they heard music. Standing at the very front of the lead landing craft, oblivious to the freezing spray and the bullets whizzing past him, was Jack Churchill. He was wearing his kilt. He was playing the bagpipes. He was playing a song called the March of the Cameron Men. The Germans didn't know what to make of it. It was an eerie, high-pitched wail cutting through the sound of the engines. The boat hit the sand. The ramp slammed down. Jack stopped playing. He dropped the pipes. He drew his sword. He raised it high in the air and screamed, "Commando!" He sprinted off the boat. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He had a 3-pound bar of steel. He ran straight at the German bunkers. The sight of a screaming madman waving a sword was too much for the defenders. It was psychological warfare. You train a soldier to fight other soldiers with guns. You don't train him to fight a Viking berserker. Jack and his men overran the garrison. They blew up the fish oil factories that were supplying explosives to the Nazis. They captured the German code books. During the battle, a demolition charge went off too close to Jack. A piece of shrapnel grazed his forehead. Blood poured down his face. Most men would have called for a medic. Jack wiped the blood out of his eyes, laughed, and asked for a bottle of wine from the captured German stores. He finished the raid with a bandage around his head, carrying his sword, smiling for the official war photographer. That photograph made it back to England. It made it to the newspapers. The legend of Mad Jack began to grow. But his greatest feat, the one that defied all logic, was yet to come.
July 1943. The commandos were sent to Italy. They landed at Salerno. The fighting in Italy was brutal. It wasn't like the quick raids in Norway. This was a slow, grinding slog through the mountains. The Germans held the high ground. They had dug into the rocky hillsides with mortars and machine guns. One of these positions was a town called Pigoletti. It was a crucial strong point. The Germans had it locked down. Jack Churchill was ordered to take the town. He looked at the terrain. It was steep. It was covered in thick brush. If he sent his men up in a standard attack, they would be slaughtered by machine gun fire. Jack decided he would do it his way. He would do it at night, and he would bring his sword. He ordered his men to stay back and provide covering fire if things went wrong. He selected one man to go with him, a corporal named Ruffel. "We're going to take the town," Jack said. "Just the two of us, sir?" Ruffel asked. "Just the two of us," Jack replied. "It will be quieter that way." Jack strapped on his sword belt. He slung his carbine over his shoulder, but he didn't hold it. He gripped the hilt of his claymore. They moved out into the darkness. The Italian night was pitch black. The crickets were chirping. Jack moved with the silence of a hunter. He had spent years stalking deer in Scotland. He knew how to walk without breaking a twig. They crept up the hill. They reached the outskirts of the town. They found the first German sentry post. Two men were manning a machine gun, staring out into the darkness, looking for a British attack force. They never looked behind them. Jack stepped out of the shadows. He didn't shoot. The noise would wake the whole town. He raised his sword. The moonlight caught the blade. "Hände hoch," Jack whispered. "Hands up." The German soldiers spun around. Imagine their terror. They were expecting a soldier in khaki. Instead, they saw a giant figure looming over them, holding a sword straight at their throats. It broke their brains. It was primal fear. They dropped their weapons. Jack signaled for them to be quiet. He handed their weapons to Corporal Ruffel. Then Jack did something brilliant. He didn't tie them up. He didn't kill them. He used them. He prodded the first German with the tip of his sword. "March," he whispered. He made the prisoner walk in front of him. He used the German as a human shield. They moved to the next foxhole. The sentries there heard footsteps. They assumed it was their own patrol coming back. "Hans, is that you?" Then Jack stepped out from behind the prisoner. The sword flashed. "Surrender." The second group surrendered. Now Jack had 4 prisoners. Most soldiers would have stopped there. They would have taken the intel and gone back to base. 4 prisoners is a good night's work. Jack Churchill was just getting started. He left the prisoners with Corporal Ruffel, who covered them with his Bren gun. Jack moved deeper into the town. He went from post to post. He was a ghost. He appeared out of the darkness, screaming like a demon, waving his sword. The Germans were disoriented. They were sleepy, and they were terrified of this madman. In one house, he found a squad of men sleeping. He kicked the door open. He stood there, the sword gleaming. The Germans scrambled for their rifles, but they saw the look in his eyes. They froze. He rounded them up. He marched them outside. He collected prisoners like he was collecting stamps. At one point, he stumbled upon a mortar crew. These were the men who had been shelling the British lines for days. They were busy loading shells. Jack walked right up to them. He tapped the commander on the shoulder with the flat of his blade. The commander turned around. His eyes went wide. He looked at the sword. He looked at his Luger pistol. He looked back at the sword. He put his hands up. By the time the sun began to rise, Jack and Corporal Ruffel had cleared the entire perimeter. They began the walk back to the British lines. It was a sight that no one who saw it would ever forget. Coming down the hill was a column of men, 10, 20, 30, 40. At the back of the column was Corporal Ruffel, looking exhausted and carrying a mountain of confiscated rifles. And walking alongside the column, guarding them, was Jack Churchill. He was strolling casually. He had his sword resting on his shoulder. He was smoking a cigarette. He had captured 42 German soldiers. He had captured a mortar squad. He had taken the town, and he had done it all without firing a single shot. When he got back to base, his commanding officer looked at the prisoners. He looked at Jack's sword. "In how?" the officer asked. Jack shrugged. "I maintain that as long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, if you are senior to him, he will cry 'Jawohl' and get on with it enthusiastically." The Germans hadn't been defeated by superior firepower. They had been defeated by pure, unadulterated confidence. After Italy, the legend of Mad Jack was known across the Allied armies. But Jack wasn't finished. In 1944, he was sent to Yugoslavia. The mission was to help the partisans, the local resistance fighters, attack a German strongpoint on the island of Broch. It was a suicide mission. The Germans were dug in on top of a mountain called Hill 622. They had barbed wire, mines, and heavy artillery. Jack led the attack. He organized a mixed force of commandos and partisans. They charged up the hill. The German fire was withering. Men were falling left and right. The partisans, brave as they were, started to waver. They pulled back. Jack didn't pull back. He kept climbing. He reached the top of the hill with only 6 men. 6 men against hundreds of Germans. They found a shell crater and jumped in. They were pinned down. Mortar shells were exploding all around them. Bullets were chewing up the dirt. One by one, the men with Jack were hit. 3 were killed. 3 were badly wounded. Soon, Jack was the only one left who could fight. He looked at his situation. He was surrounded. He was out of ammunition for his carbine. His sword was at his side, but he couldn't get close enough to use it. The Germans were closing in. Most men would have surrendered. Most men would have prayed. Jack Churchill pulled out his bagpipes. There, on top of a mountain in Yugoslavia, surrounded by the dead and dying, with mortar shells raining down, a sound rose up. "Will ye no come back again?" It was a sad, haunting Scottish tune. The Germans stopped firing for a moment. They couldn't believe their ears. Was that music? Jack stood up in the crater. He played the pipes with tears in his eyes for his fallen men. He played as the Germans crept closer. Then a German grenade landed in the crater. It exploded. The concussion knocked Jack unconscious. The bagpipes groaned as he fell on top of them. The Germans rushed the crater. They found him lying there, bleeding, still holding the pipes. They rolled him over. They saw the rank on his shoulder. Colonel. They saw his name, Churchill. They panicked. They thought they had captured Winston Churchill's son. They thought they had the most valuable prisoner of the war. They radioed Berlin immediately. "We have Churchill." Jack woke up in chains. He was dragged onto a plane and flown to Berlin for interrogation. When the Gestapo realized he wasn't related to the Prime Minister, that he was just a crazy soldier who happened to have the same last name, they were furious. But they didn't kill him. He was still a high-ranking officer. They sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp.
For most men, Sachsenhausen was the end of the line. It was a place of death and misery. For Jack Churchill, it was just a challenge. He was locked in the special compound for prominent prisoners, but walls meant nothing to him. In September 1944, Jack and an RAF officer named Bertram James crawled under the wire. They had dug a small tunnel using old spoons and bowls. They made it out. They were in the heart of Nazi Germany. They had no map. They had no food. They had no weapons. Jack looked at the stars. He knew the Baltic Sea was north. If he could get to the sea, he could steal a boat and row to Sweden. They walked for miles. They hid in forests by day and moved by night. They ate stolen vegetables from farms. They made it almost to the coast, but the German dragnet was too tight. They were spotted by a patrol. Jack was captured again. This time, The Germans weren't taking any chances. They sent him to a prison camp in Austria, guarded by the SS. As the war neared its end in April 1945, the SS guards got orders. The prisoners were to be executed. They were not to be allowed to fall into Allied hands. Jack watched the SS men setting up machine guns. He knew this was it. But Jack Churchill had one more stroke of luck. A unit of regular German army soldiers, the Wehrmacht, arrived. They were commanded by a captain named Richard von Alvensleben. The Wehrmacht hated the SS. Captain von Alvensleben saw the SS preparing to murder unarmed prisoners. He moved his men in. He aimed his anti-tank guns at the SS guards. "Back off," he told them. "These prisoners are under my protection." The SS backed down. They fled into the mountains. Jack was free. Most prisoners waited for the Americans to arrive with trucks and food. Jack didn't like waiting. He walked away. He walked 93 miles across the Alps to meet the American lines in Italy. He walked up to an American armored unit. He was wearing a ragged uniform. He was thin. He looked like a beggar. But he stood tall. He saluted the American commander. "Colonel Jack Churchill," he said, "reporting for duty."
Jack was flown back to England. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Nazis had surrendered. Most soldiers were celebrating. They were going home to their families. They were done with fighting. Jack was disappointed. "There's still the Japanese," he said. He volunteered immediately for the Pacific Campaign. He was sent to Burma. He was getting ready for the invasion of Japan. He had his sword sharpened. He had new arrows made. He was fully prepared to storm the beaches of Tokyo with his longbow. But while he was in India preparing to deploy, the news came. The Americans had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The war was over. When Jack heard the news, he didn't cheer. He threw his gloves across the room in anger. He looked at his friends and said the most Jack Churchill thing possible. "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. He was genuinely upset that peace had broken out.
With the war over, Jack tried to settle down. But settling down for Jack was different than for normal people. He qualified as a parachutist at the age of 40. He moved to Australia for a while. He became a passionate surfer. In fact, he was one of the first people to surf the Severn Bore, a massive tidal wave that rushes up the River Severn in England. He designed his own surfboards. Years later, people in London would tell stories about a strange man on the train. Every day, on his commute home from work, this man would stand up as the train passed a specific backyard, open the window, and hurl his briefcase out into the garden. The passengers were terrified. They thought he was crazy. It was Jack. He had realized that his backyard backed up to the train tracks. He threw his briefcase into his own garden so he wouldn't have to carry it from the station. It was practical. It was efficient. It was Jack. Jack Churchill died in 1996 at the age of 89. He lived a long, full life, but he was never quite as alive as he was in 1943, standing in the dark in Italy, holding a sword against the throat of the enemy. Historians often focus on the technology of World War II. They talk about the tanks, the planes, the atomic bombs. They talk about how the war changed modern combat. But Jack Churchill is a reminder of something else. He reminds us that war is ultimately fought by human beings, and sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't a machine gun. It's the man who refuses to follow the rules. The Germans mocked his bow. They laughed at his sword. They thought he was a joke from a history book. But in the end, the joke was on them, because you can calculate the range of a rifle. You can predict the blast of a mortar, but you can never predict what a man will do when he charges into machine gun fire playing the bagpipes. If you enjoyed this story of the wildest soldier in history, please hit that like button. I'll see you in the next one.